The Great Indian Revolt of 1857, it didn't just pop up out of thin air. It was actually the violent explosion of a century of simmering anger. And that anger, well, it didn't start in the army barracks. It started in the villages and fields of India. We're going to explore just how a trading company's policies could end up planting the seeds for such a massive, massive rebellion. So how on earth did this happen? Well, it really all boils down to one simple thing: cash. The British East India Company had become a ruling power, and it desperately needed a steady, predictable flow of money from India. That money was for funding its trade, its expansion, everything. And that single-minded obsession with revenue would end up completely re-engineering Indian society with some absolutely devastating consequences. And look, this was not an overnight thing. As you can see from this timeline, it all kicked off with the Battle of Plassey back in 1757. That's when the company first grabbed real power. And over the next 100 years, they made a series of decisions, new tax systems, new land policies, that just kept adding layers and layers of resentment, until it all finally hit a breaking point in 1857. All right, so let's start with our first case study. We're heading to Bengal. After the chaos of the 1770s, which included a really horrific famine, the British knew they needed a much more organized way to pull wealth out of the country. Their goal was pretty simple: secure a regular income no matter what. So what was their big idea? It was something called the permanent settlement. And on paper, the logic seemed pretty clever. By fixing the tax amount forever, the British were hoping for two things. First, a nice, steady, predictable stream of cash. And second, they'd create a loyal class of Indian landlords, these zamindars, who would have a reason to invest in their land. Because, hey, any extra profit they made was theirs to keep. But here's the thing. The reality on the ground? Way more complicated. See, you had the official tax collector, the zamindar, who was often living it up in the city. But back in the village, a whole new power player was on the rise, the jotadar. These guys were wealthy peasants who actually lived right there among the farmers. They controlled local trade, they were the moneylenders. That gave them real power, and they would often tell the other peasants not to pay the zamindar, just to watch his authority crumble while their own power grew. And you have to understand, the pressure on these zamindars was absolutely immense, because the system had zero flexibility. I mean, check out this sunset law. It meant the tax, which was brutally high by the way, had to be paid on time, no excuses. Didn't matter if there was a drought or a bad harvest. If a zamindar failed, his lands were auctioned off. And you can bet that immense pressure was passed right down to the peasants. Okay, so that's Bengal. But this same relentless drive for money, it looked a little different in other places. Let's head over to the Rajmahal Hills. Here, the conflict wasn't just about taxes. No, this was a clash between two completely different ways of life, and the British were actively pushing one to destroy the other, all for profit. So on one side, you had the Paharias. They were the original people of these hills. They lived with the forest, used the hoe for a type of farming called shifting cultivation, and they saw the British as hostile invaders. On the other side were the Santals. They were skilled farmers who used the plow for settled agriculture. And the British looked at them and saw the perfect tool to clear those forests and turn them into nice, taxable farmland. So to make this all official, the British basically drew a line on a map and created a new territory called the Damin-e-Ko. They gave it to the Santals, pushing the Paharias deeper into the hills. But this wasn't some generous gift. It was a contract. The Santals were expected to clear the land and generate revenue. And wouldn't you know it, soon enough, they found themselves caught in the very same trap of high taxes and crushing debt. It got so bad that they launched their own massive revolt in 1855, just 2 years before the Great Rebellion. All right, let's head south now, to the Deccan region. And you'll see it's a different system, but a tragically familiar story for the people on the ground. This time, the British tried something called the Ryotwari system. The idea was to cut out the middleman and collect taxes directly from the Ryot, the peasant. And unlike in Bengal, the tax wasn't permanent. So what was the problem? Well, the initial tax demand was just sky high, often way more than the land could ever produce, especially if you had a bad year. And you can probably guess what happened next. It created this absolutely brutal, vicious cycle. The harvest fails, but the tax is still due. The peasant has no choice but to go to the local moneylender, the sahukar. The sahukar gives him the loan, but at interest rates so insane the peasant could never hope to pay it back. They'd be forced to sign these debt bonds, basically becoming servants on land that used to be their own. Okay, stop and think about this for a second. You've got this incredible anger just simmering across Bengal, the hills, the Deccan, all over. And here is the absolute key to the whole thing. The soldiers, the sepoys in the East India Company's gigantic army, they weren't some separate elite class. They were the sons and brothers of these exact same peasants. That's exactly why people call the sepoys peasants in uniform. A soldier's identity was still completely tied to his village. The letters he was getting from home weren't filled with good news. They were stories of crushing taxes, of debt piling up, of the family losing its land. The anger of the countryside was now pumping through the veins of the army itself. So you have all this dry tinder, just waiting for a match. And that spark? It came in the form of a rumor about the new Enfield's rifle cartridges. See, to load the rifle, a soldier had to bite the cartridge open. And the rumor was that they were greased with cow and pig fat, a direct, deeply offensive attack on the core religious beliefs of both Hindu and Muslim sepoys. And just like that, it exploded. It all kicked off in Meerut on May 10th. The sepoys mutinied, freed their jailed comrades, and marched straight to Delhi. By proclaiming the old Mughal emperor as their leader, they instantly turned a military mutiny into a full-blown political rebellion. And now, with a symbol to rally around, the revolt just spread like wildfire. Now, it's so important to get this straight. This was not just random, mindless violence. The rebels had a very clear vision. They weren't just trying to destroy the British system. They were trying to restore a world that they felt had been stolen from them. I mean, if you actually look at what they were saying, at their proclamations, their demands were crystal clear. They wanted an end to the crushing taxes. They wanted to protect their religions from what they saw as a constant cultural attack. And maybe most importantly, they called for Hindu-Muslim unity against a common enemy, the Ferengi, the foreigner. In the end, the rebellion was crushed, and it was brutal. But its impact was absolutely monumental. It sent such a shockwave through the British system that the government completely abolished the East India Company and took direct control of India. The age of the company was over. The age of the British Raj had just begun. And that really leaves us with one big question to think about. On one hand, the revolt was clearly the last desperate gasp of an old order of kings and landlords. Good. Was it also something more? By bringing together so many different people, peasants, soldiers, Hindus, and Muslims, against one common enemy, did the rebellion of 1857 maybe forge a new kind of consciousness, a shared identity that would, in the end, fuel the long, long struggle for an independent India?